So by giving such strong support, I think the Prime Minister felt able also to move on these two less agreeable to Israel messages.
The Prime Minister has been speaking at the British Embassy in Berlin following a so-called Quad meeting with President Biden, Chancellor Scholz of Germany and the French President Macron. Keir Starmer began by addressing the news of the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Well, let's hear from Lord Simon McDonald, who's former permanent secretary at the Foreign Office. He was also British ambassador to Israel. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Kathy.
I mean, there's so much to get into here, but let's start on Israel and come to Ukraine in a minute, and then China, if I may. It was interesting. Keir Starmer was pretty robust in his words, talking about the world will not tolerate any more excuses on humanitarian assistance, and yet he held the line on arms sales, saying that the position had not changed. What do you think the reaction inside the Foreign Office will be to that stance?
Well, the Foreign Office implements the policy of the government of the day, Kathy. I think the key takeaways from the Prime Minister's statements in Berlin were, one, continuing solid support for Israel, its right to self-defense, but two things implied behind that. One is that with the killing of Yahya Sinwar, Israel has now achieved the last objective, which outsiders could see was an obstacle to a ceasefire. So there's pressure from the UK and other allies to move more quickly towards a ceasefire. And second, that humanitarian access is an issue for allies because promises made early in the year have evidently not been kept. So that needs to change. So by giving such strong support, I think the Prime Minister felt able also to move on these two less agreeable to Israel messages.
But on that, the pressure coming on Israel to move now towards striking some kind of deal, there's no signs that Israel will bow to that pressure, is there? And indeed, it's in Netanyahu's political interest, really, to keep this war going.
That is how it is interpreted, and I agree all his actions show that he wishes to continue. But more than 1 year since the original atrocity, the number of military objectives left for Israel in Gaza is now very much reduced. So the question is being asked, particularly in private, what is the benefit from continuing the military action in Gaza? Because it seems to be ever less.
I mean, if given the words were strong, but the actions didn't really follow it up in terms of extending that arms embargo from Keir Starmer, do you think that it is possible that, or even advisable for Keir Starmer to double down on extending that arms embargo in the next few weeks, few days, or do you see that remaining as it is now?
I see it remaining as it is. I think it will be driven by legal advice. This was advice that was in gestation under the previous government. It was delayed for whatever reason until after the general election. So what the government has done is, in response to that legal advice, when that shifts, there'll be a shift in policy, but I don't anticipate that will be soon.
Right. And also a holding pattern really on Ukraine, because although he pointed out that Russia is getting weaker, he said he'd back Ukraine for as long as it takes, but there was no movement on that supply of the long-range missiles, the Storm Shadow missiles, which the UK is insistent that it needs US permission, agreement to give Ukraine permission to use them on targets in Russia. Do you see that as a sort of delicate holding pattern, keeping the US happy and, trying to keep Ukraine happy too?
I think all of the discussion on Ukraine in Berlin today would have focused on the transition that's about to happen in the United States. There will be a new president by the end of January, and leaders in private have to consider what would happen if Donald Trump were re-elected on the 5th of November. He's stated very clearly his policy will be different. So I think the four leaders today were thinking how they could shore up the international effort before a transition to a more hostile to existing administration. my personal view on arms supplies is that once you've supplied them, you are supplying them to a country you clearly support, and you should trust them to use those arms in the best way to defend themselves. So personally, I would give greater latitude.
Oh, that's interesting, because a lot of Conservatives, including the former Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, for example, have said that the UK should be doing exactly what you said, just saying to Ukraine, go ahead, almost not in these words, but don't worry about the US on this one, use them as you see fit. That's kind of, you think the UK should be a bit more bullish on that?
A bit more bullish, but remember that the chief supplier is the United States. So if Ukraine were to do something explicitly against US wishes, that would affect future supplies. So I would urge the Ukrainians to continue the conversation with Washington.
And let me come now to China. I mean, there's so many different foreign policy areas to get into, but this is a very interesting shift. If we've been talking about Israel and Ukraine as not much change, there is an important shift, isn't there, in terms of the current government's attitude to China compared to the previous one. Is that wise? Do you think it's doable, that change, that to a more sort of pragmatic relationship with China?
I know that the previous government had several different policies towards China over its 14 years. So in some ways, what is happening now is quite familiar. I note, too, that we shouldn't get hung up on contact. Contact does not imply approval. Contact means that we have business to do with China. And with the second biggest economy in the world, of course, we have business to do, not only commercial business, but political business. So I think it is correct to recalibrate. The UK and China are both permanent members of the Security Council. We should be talking about the full range of international issues.
Yeah, and he did raise human rights. We had a readout at the meeting. He raised human rights. But you wonder how forceful he was on some of those issues. He also talked about the war in Ukraine, for example. But if you were advising him, if you were in the Foreign Office now advising him, would you advise him to raise that but not really push it?
Human rights have been a constant feature of the dialogue between London and Beijing since the Tiananmen Square massacre in the late 80s. The Chinese agreed to a human rights dialogue as they were trying to rehabilitate their international reputation. So this has been a feature for more than 30 years now. In my experience, it is at its most effective when it is private, that the difficult messages are easier for the Chinese to digest if they're done in private. The Chinese really resist and dislike grandstanding. So, of course, there are certain groups that will be never satisfied, no matter the reports that come out of the Foreign Secretary or his office about how he presented. But I think that diplomatic approach is more effective.
So you mean the readout sort of touches on all of these issues? He may well have said more in private that was perhaps more robust.
Exactly. I don't know, but there is a downside to presenting yourself in a too tough a way in public.
Just briefly, and we could spend a whole discussion on this, to be honest, but just standing back, David Lammy talks about his foreign policy being one of progressive realism, which sounds very much like what Tony Blair used to talk about, and of course that got him into trouble in Iraq. Do you think foreign policy has been calibrated in the right way under this government? How would you like to see it take shape now?
The government is 3 months old. It's clearly feeling its way forward. But one advantage the new government has is that its ministers were mostly shadowing their portfolios for the last couple of years. So David Lammy has had some chance to think about what he does, and he's encapsulated this in the idea of pragmatic realism. As you point out, this is not all that different from some previous attempts, but our situation in the world is not all that different from the last couple of decades. So I don't think it's a surprise that it's a development of existing ideas rather than a radical departure.
Lord McDonald, thank you very much for joining us.